to hear this old codger talk about one of the great men of our time, Warren Bonython. In 1981, I spent the year on teacher exchange. I took Geraldine and our 4 kids to Canada for the year, and it was there in Toronto in June that the letter arrived. I'm thinking of walking around Lake Eyre in the winter of 1982. It will take 30 days. Would you like to join me in it? Warren, the old desert master, was back, and so here was my second chance to join him in what was certain to be an epic desert journey. I accepted his invitation, and on return to Australia in December, commenced preparations. And Warren had been preparing for almost 3 years. I had to secure special leave for the walk, and friend and colleague Des Spate, then a superintendent in the education department, came to the rescue and was able to organise 6 weeks special leave for me to join Warren for the Lake Eyre circumambulation. Now I'm going to stop talking so much. I'm going to take you on a journey around the lake with Warren and me via a 30-minute roughly movie which I shot. I was the photographer. There were only 2 of us there. I'm not good on photography. The Super 8 movie was hung together by Ashley Radcliffe, a friend, put together as a 30-minute film. In 2002, we transferred it to a videotape, and then in 2012-13, the museum transferred it to a DVD, and that's what we're going to screen now. Well, Warren Bonython had been an industrial chemist working in solar salt during his professional career, and over many years had developed a deep affection for salt lakes and the desert which contained them. And he loved bushwalking. It was inevitable that his love of walking and of salt lakes would come together, and they did in 1982. Warren had spent 3 years planning and preparing for how it could be done with little or no outside help. Warren was a master of planning and had the daily distance to be covered worked out. 10 miles or 16 kilometres was the target. He left a map with Colleen Mitchell at Malura showing where we should be at the end, each day's end. Just before setting off, he handed me a map of where the food caches were buried. That was just in case he dropped dead during the walk. In preparing, he tried backpacking impossible 100-pound loads of water and placing them at 16-kilometre intervals along the lake shore. He abandoned that idea because it was too much like hard work. So he designed, built and trialled the Lake Eyre drag-in, a small 2-wheeled car. And a month before the walk, he and Bunty engaged Dave Hogan of Lloyd's Helicopters to help place 3 7-day and 1 2-day cache of food and water at strategic points around the lake. Each cache contained a 4-gallon plastic drum of dehydrated food, 8 plastic 2-gallon jerry cans of water, and a 2-litre cask of red wine, marked with a 6 feet high dowling tripod topped with a white flag. Warren's plan was to work his way over 7 days from one cache to the next, re-provision and then head for the next cache 7 days away. And that's how he planned to negotiate the great Lake Eyre salty wilderness, and here we are. That's okay, you did well. This is just, sorry about the quality, you know why. Warren's little Suzuki and his mini moat, which I bought from him for the Lake Eyre expedition. This is just before we were setting off across the Frome estuary. You can see that rather brown, dirty-looking estuary of the Frome River, which comes into Lake Eyre. But before we had to start, you've obviously must ensure you're very clean, because that's about the only time you're going to be clean. And so Warren is having his bath before we leave, and then pretty soon after that, we saddled up, put ourselves together with the carts, and here he is with his total 95 65 pounds on his back, 95 pounds on the cart, all set to take off at the age of 65 years on our circumambulation of Lake Eyre. So that's my cart, Dragon 2, and here's Warren stepping off at the beginning of our 530 kilometre journey. You can't take too many interesting photos around Lake Eyre because it's all pretty much the same. However, I did take a lot, in fact. And here we're at our first campsite here with Warren's tent. He'd been using it for years and he used it all of his walking life. And he's sitting around the campfire, preparing the evening meal, or might have been breakfast on this occasion. But there's the Frome estuary with a bit of salt cover in the middle distance in the background, in an otherwise very barren and desolate, dry, arid landscape. He's sitting on his food box. Now, this is an amazing sight. He's looking at his notes of 1980 when he tried to backpack these 100-pound loads of water. He was trying to find 2 gallons of water. Look, he came to this spot, looked around, looked at his notes, targeted a spot and prodded. Bang! Landed on the spot right at the very moment. I couldn't believe my eyes. I thought to myself, who is this guy? Some kind of divinity or something? And of course, always meticulous with any tears or rips in clothing. He always had his needle and thread with him to make any repairs as necessary. And you can imagine, in an environment like this, your sort of feeling of your place in the scheme of things becomes pretty insignificant when you're looking at a landscape like this. That's we're on Madigan Gulf with a good salt cover out near on the horizon and a mix of salt and silt on the nearer shoreline. And there's our gear, our kit on the surface. We came ashore each day for lunch, and Warren was always writing notes, adding notes, checking the notes that he'd written in 1980 and on previous occasions. You can see it's a fairly daunting, forbidding sort of landscape. No surface water, you had to have everything under control before you went. Water had to be assured, and Warren had done that by putting caches in place about a month beforehand. And we're heading up the east coast of Madigan Gulf, and the tallest vegetation was a niter bush, which made reasonable cover, and it made, when its roots dried out, really excellent firewood. We used it as often as we could. So we're heading up towards the Cooper mouth, the mouth of the Cooper Creek, which comes in from the eastern side of the lake. Not the best photography by any means. Looks like the sun going around the horizon during the winter sun up in the northern hemisphere. Our camp, just the 2 tents and our dragons, our fire going. We usually found sufficient wood to have a good fire on the night that we finished, and every morning sufficient to have a fire to start a cup of tea, the daily cup of tea. And where we could, we'd shelter behind a niter bush with our tents. It was midwinter and in the desert, and the desert's pretty cold places in midwinter. Morning temperatures tended to be around 1 or 2, sometimes north. Day temperatures sometimes got up to 20, but seemed to hover around 14, 15. And Warren, of course, carried a thermometer to keep a daily check on these statistics. There's his 1 gallon water can, very careful with the measurement of water. It was all to last us for a week, so it was quite an operation ensuring that it was going to last. Now, Warren had an inbuilt shock absorber in the shaft, and it wasn't giving him a very comfortable ride. So he dismantled it, and he had some, I'm not sure what it was, but I think it might have been lacenil or some sort of oily substance, which he lubricated the spring with, and then he's reassembling the shock absorber, and you can see it's spring loaded. Now reinserting, you can see it's got a little bit of give there. It was designed to give a little bit of a cushioning effect as he dragged this cart behind him. This is Warren dispensing with the bit of water that he allowed for washing up the dishes, and the nearest niter bush became an effective drying rack. That's what we always use for our drying. It's a bit of a dog's breakfast, the campsite. There was no one else there, so we weren't too fussed about how we looked. And we didn't get too fussed about how we were, because we were pretty hot and sweaty through the time, because we didn't wash. There wasn't enough water for that, except at the end of each week when we had a 2-gallon jerry can, for that especially. And we're heading now, soon after this, towards the, as I said, towards the Cooper. Fairly common sight looking across Lake Eyre. Days sunny mostly, shimmering salt. Here Warren is using one of the wine containers, now empty of course. He found a dead bird on the lake surface and he was a bit interested in what it was. So he cut a hole in this plastic container, put the bird in it, and gave it to Dave Hogan, who was the helicopter pilot, and he was to take it to the South Australian Museum for them to do the identification. So Warren has got the bird, where it was discovered on the lake, all ready to go down to the museum, courtesy of Dave Hogan. Brings back happy memories. Now, here we are near the mouth of the Warburton Creek, I think. Not. The panning was a little bit over the top here. But it's a daunting landscape, as you can see. And I think this is Warren. I thought he was preparing the aerial for our daily contact with Colleen Mitchell at Malurina. We made a deal that we would contact Colleen every morning at about 8 o'clock just to let them know that we were okay and that we were sort of about where we were supposed to be according to the map. We've gone beyond that now, and we've gone with Dave Hogan, who was working for Delhi, and they were shooting, there's our tracks on the right, those two little two-wheel tracks. Delhi was shooting a seismic traverse across the lake, and we encouraged Dave to give us a look at the lake where we were heading in the helicopter. Oh, it was a brief moment of bliss, but we weren't encouraged by what we saw looking north. But it was nice while it lasted, and we're coming back to our little base, our little camp on the near the just south of the Cooper mouth. Delhi were just about to finish their seismic traverse at the time, so we were lucky that we were able to meet Dave and to have this little helicopter ride. Lots of silt, mostly on the edge of the lake. It's full of decomposed silt brought in by the big rivers and drain into the lake every now and then. And here we come, getting close to our camp. As I said, it was nice while it lasted. next camp, and familiar sight, familiar surroundings, lots of silt out on the lake surface. As we went further north on the Lake Eyre north, salt became less widespread, and silt, dirt and dust certainly more widespread. Now, this is the murder territory. We're crossing the Cooper Mouth here. The Cooper Mouth is 7 kilometres across. It's got 2 channels, most pretty shallow, but full of puff dust. Warren called it puff dust. It's decomposed silt, about 2 or 3 inches deep, and we had to pull through about 3 kilometres of that stuff. So I thought it was worth showing Warren in full flight, pulling a total load of 195 pounds on back and on the cart across the mouth of the Cooper. We're the only people who've ever walked across the mouth of the Cooper, and Warren let me lead. I was really delighted that I was the first person to walk across the mouth of the Cooper. And progressing north, Warren is now preparing the aerial. I got ahead of myself, preparing the aerial for the daily contact, using his custom-built Kodan radio to get in touch with Colleen Mitchell at Malurina. And we also made contact with the Royal Flying Doctor base at Port Augusta a couple of times a week, and we each made contact with our respective wives. Warren really did like to keep in touch with Bunty, even though he was in really remote places. And this is the Calaverina estuary, not an encouraging sight by any means, but negotiated without much trouble as we were moving north towards the northern end of the lake. I actually got bogged in a little sortie across that part of the river, and thought it might not be a very nice place to be crossing the next day, but it turned out to be quite negotiable, and I wasn't bogged on any other occasion except way towards the end. There he is, just below a little cliff. We were walking below sea level, we realised, for the entire journey. Lake Eyre, the entire surface is below sea level. And the surface, the edge, these low cliffs, quite scarred. Now Warren is having his carefully planned Lake Eyre lunch and desert lunch. 40 grams of Cadbury's Dairy Milk Chocolate, 40 grams of dates, 40 grams of sultanas, 40 grams of Kraft cheese. Kraft cheese is the best cheese in the world. Well, it was there. And there was no waste because there wasn't much to eat anyway. But it was calculated pretty well, and it sustained us throughout the whole journey. He's making breakfast here, and powdered milk is being reconstituted with some of our water. The billy is on, which I was responsible for, and then the water and milk mix was poured onto 2 sachets of instant porridge. Added to that were what Warren called lashings of sugar. We ate sugar like it was going out of fashion because we were burning it all off. Then he'd mix it up and consume his porridge in the morning. And after that, we had also a cup of tea and a cup of tang before. Tang's a vitamin C extract to keep away cold and flu germs, you realise? Take it from me, no self-respecting flu germ would live up there of the production of the, and there we go. Rather more water than you would expect to be used as a wash-up. We weren't keen on eating out of dirty plates, so we did allow a little bit of water for washing. But Warren had allowed for that. Now we've got right up in the northwest corner here, near the Niels Delta, coming in from the northwest corner of Lake Eyre North, and we stumbled on this rather marvellous pool of fresh water, but the temperature was about 4 degrees, and we weren't about to have a bath, even though we certainly needed it. But it was one of the channels of the Niels Delta. The Niels comes in the northwest section, and obviously there'd been rain at some stage to give those channels a really good coating of water. There were a few water birds around, including a lone seagull that seemed to have become marooned, got lost or something, when the bird life was much more abundant. I think there's a couple of ducks there as well as the seagull. But it was a nice sight, quite therapeutic to see water in a desert, although we didn't drink any of it, and we certainly didn't bathe in it. And Warren found it a good opportunity to go for a little walk without putting the load, and stepped off in the surrounds to catch the environment without the enormous load becoming an encumbrance for him. And after the Niels Delta, this was a really troublesome time. This was the most difficult place to negotiate in the entire walk. For 2 days we blundered around on this channeled, deeply scarred, poorly vegetated area with lots of channels and gullies, giving us a really bumpy, rocky ride, and we were never quite sure where we were. A good time to get rid of the whole load and go for a walk without it. Got his good sand shoes on for the camp walking, and of course desert boots for the walk on the lake. Back to the tent, and preparation for the next little foray. We're getting down towards the, heading down south now on the western side of the lake. And here he is loading up. He had a really good plan. When he stopped for a rest, he'd take the food box off the cart, put it on the ground, sit on it, let the pack settle on the 4 anchor points on the food box, sit down, undo the straps, loosen the straps, take his shoulders out of the straps, and and move forward and step away from that load. And he'd repeat he would reverse that process immediately after when we resumed our walk. As you can see, we're not in a terribly inviting surface here, with lots of footprints and marks. And here he goes, heading off again across some little tufts of meagre grass with little bits of sand that have blown against it. And finding it a bit of a struggle. We have to bear in mind that Warren's 65 years old here. Not the sort of thing that most 65-year-olds do. Not even a 44-year-old. At the time I was 44. I was the junior apprentice walker. Again, not a very inspiring sunrise photo or sunset. However, things will improve, I hope. Very familiar surface. I was always looking for really nice hard salt. There wasn't very much of it around on Lake Eyre. We had to wait till very late in the walk before we got to what I considered was probably the most likely cover, but it was not to be. Yes, a few dunes on the edge in places, covered with niter bush, and offering some shelter some of the time from a couple of the windy nights that we had. Deserts tend to be windy places, and so we were lucky to find some spots where there was a little bit of shelter. There were no nice red gums, unfortunately, but that's what we had, and we had to make the best of that. Warren liked to be sure that the food container was clean before preparing any meal. And the freedom of, it was quite therapeutic getting the load off and just going for a wander. You tended to feel as if you were going to lift up, levitate almost. It felt quite light. Pity we didn't feel like it more often, but we couldn't. He was, I think, certainly very conscious of a very strong relationship that he has with deserts and lakes as he just surveyed the surrounds and as he worked his way through this quite forbidding landscape. That little windbreaker was something that, like Warren, he fell in love with some items of apparel and garments that he wore, and indeed his tent, and they went everywhere with him. It was a mark of, it was really a signature of the man. We walked on Lake Eyre North for 24 days. It was supposed to be 21, but it took 3 days extra. It was much more difficult than we thought. At the end of it, we came to a little lump at the southern end of the lake called Prominent Hill, and that was a place where we had our food and water cache buried. And that was the end of the Lake Eyre North section, and subsequent to that we were on the lake surface the entire walk for the 24 days, and then the last section was cross country, crossing part of Lake Eyre South in a couple of places, and walking in part on some really good salt. And here we are on Prominent Hill, and our camp is down there in the wilderness, and that's Lake Eyre North, stretching away into the distance about 100 kilometres north to the northern end of the lake. And Warren, of course, had buried the food and water near Prominent Hill, and we were able to rescue them and sustain ourselves for the next 8 days. And this is me and my great Canadian $10 windbreaker that I brought back from Canada, preparing my lunch for one of the days. Looking as if I need a shave and probably a haircut as well, but there was no chance of that for some time. But we were committed to the same food every day for 33 days. The cheese, the dates, sultanas, chocolate, porridge, biscuits, ham, honey and jam. We're at Emerald Spring, about 3/4 of the way through the southern section, the Lake Eyre South section. Warren is wearing a headband, as you'll notice, and he did this every time. At the end of each week, when we had to re-provision, our underwear went on the fire. It just went on the fire. No one was going to take that sort of underwear home. But Warren always rescued the waistband of the underpants, and that became his headband. Keep the hair out of his eyes, and to be a sweatband. And we're at Emerald Spring. You know, we're on the edge of the Great Artesian Basin here, in the southwest section. This is where lots of the big springs come out. Water that fell as a rain a million years ago in the eastern highlands come via aquifers through the Great Artesian Basin and spill out on the southwestern edge of Lake Eyre, and they make the Mound Springs, and other things, those remarkable features that are a reliable source of water. And this is Emerald Spring with its familiar cover of calcium carbonate and other salts which have come from dissolved and have been deposited as the water evaporated. And that was a very familiar sight around the lake, of course, because the whole lake was a salt, dry, arid salina or salt lake for the most part, although as we found, much of it was covered with horrendous silt and very difficult stuff to negotiate.
So Terry, you talked about breakfast and lunch. What did you have for dinner?
For dinner, I'll tell you, we had a cup of soup, a packet soup, of course, reconstituted with water naturally. We had surprise beans, surprise peas, deb, instant mash, and savoury mince. We had it 32 times. I took a rabbit trap with me because I was a bit of a hunter and a gatherer during my youth, And we caught 4 rabbits around the lake, even though I was in drought. And so I supplemented our evening meal with rabbit stew, or Lake Eyre lappan I call it. They actually put a piece of rabbit together with some cream of chicken soup and cook it up, and it makes quite a nice meal. And Warren was an expert on making super dampers, he called them, super damper. And he made a few of those as well. So that was our food was pretty meagre, but it was calculated, it sustained us, and we got by on it. However, I lost a stone on the journey, and I didn't look very good at the end, and Warren lost a similar amount. We come to welcome the Morris Creek bore. Morris Creek bore, there's 2 million litres of water at 41 degrees Celsius, beautiful fresh water pouring out of the ground, and we were able to take some of that for our own water supply. It was the only place we were able to take water from the environment, and we took 2 gallons, which was to see us through to the end. Morris Creek bore at 41 degrees Celsius and 2 million gallons, 2 million litres a day, was a wonderful hot bath, the only one we had. And I had to elbow him out of it to get out of it so I could get my turn. And we didn't want to leave the bath, I can tell you. But we had to, and then pretty soon after that, 2 or 3 days later, Warren had made contact with John and Roma Dale-Hunty. John was a retired university professor who had been doing for many years post-retirement Lake Eyre research. And he spent 3 months with his wife Roma every year near our base camp. So we met them at the end of the walk, or we had teed up with them, Warren had done by radio, that we will meet you at the camp, and John very kindly photographed Warren and me coming to the end of the walk, took our photos, he shook hands and said what a wonderful journey it had been. And then we had a party that night in John and Roma's hollow log, a 600-gallon galvanised iron rainwater tank, kitted out with 2 beds and living quarters. And Warren and I squeezed in. They provided the food because we didn't have any. And we had a party. Warren had 3 bottles of red wine. We had the best party I've ever seen. If we'd been in the suburbs, we would have had a visit from the police. There's no doubt about that. But we got through it, and at the very end, in the photo, in the film, Warren is taking a last look across the Frome estuary, again thinking, well, you've led us through. Never will I beat you. He always had that really lovely feeling about the environment that he was in. It led us through, and that was a nice touch that came from Warren. There was never any thought that he had conquered the lake. He was just grateful that the lake had led us through. And that night we had a hell of a party inside the hollow log, as I mentioned. And I'd never seen Warren happier. And to quote another friend of mine, Warren, he was as happy as a cat in a cream factory. It had been a severely testing time for Warren and for me, but there was never at any time the suggestion that he might abort the expedition. Walking in the desert for Warren meant well-being. It fed his soul. He needed regular doses of the desert to maintain his well-being, and Lake Eyre had been his latest requisite dose of the desert. And it had become obvious to me during that walk that over the years, Warren and deserts had developed a strong symbiotic relationship. Warren and deserts seemed to feed off each other and depend on each other. Warren belonged in the desert. He moulded into the landscape and became part of it. His sun-brown, craggy face was right for it. He understood it, worked with it, was able to read it and accommodate it. It was actually quite disarming watching him operating in and negotiating this most challenging of all environments. He was a seriously determined individual, both precise, methodical, qualities which shone through his every foray into the desert wilderness. And probably of the many personal qualities he possessed, humility, determination, resilience, uncomplaining acceptance of challenging conditions, The most outstanding of all, to me at least, was his ability to withstand physical hardship. And in that sense, Warren Bonython was just plain tough. It seemed a little contradictory that such a gentle, humble and reserved man could be so tough, but he was without any doubt the toughest person I've ever met.